Okay, so this week is going to be a little bit shorter than some of the others. We have just got 3 movies and 2 albums to discuss. So let's start off with a new one that came out on Netflix on the 15th of January. It is Sung Do-jun's directorial debut. It's called Wish You. Now, this is a prime example of a movie with a good idea, but also one that ultimately overstays its welcome and ends up becoming a more ponderous experience than it should be. This Korean LGBTQ+ romance tells the story of Kang In-soo, a musician who looks like he's about to make it big. It tells the story of him signing his first recording contract. But as you'd expect, several complications arise from this, not least his relationship that he begins to build with Choi Min-sung, his new roommate who is to watch over him 24/7. Now, there is a cute awkwardness to this movie that I did find quite charming, despite how unbearably melodramatic it is. It is sugary, it is sweet, it does go down pretty easy, and the characters are all pretty straightforward to empathize with. It's not a movie that's trying to do anything revelatory, and in many ways you could argue that it doesn't need to. The story needs to be the main focus, after all. Unfortunately, while the story starts off pretty well, some of the drama towards the end can feel a little bit forced and shoehorned in. Apparently this was supposed to be a mini-series of like 10-minute episodes or so that was put together into a feature film, and wow, does it show in the construction. It's forced and clunky in spots in a way that really doesn't feel natural, especially in the scene where Kang In-soo's painfully cliche tragic backstory is revealed. And none of that is helped by some very unstable pacing. It makes for a movie that's got a lot of heart and a lot of characters, but not one where it feels like much is really at stake. They could have done a lot more, I feel. They could have explored the craziness of the K-pop industry in greater detail, or it could have explored the emotionally exhausting creative process and what that can do to someone emotionally in greater detail. Instead, we just get a soulful, colourful, but not especially memorable movie. It just feels underweight across the board, as if it's on the cusp of a real breakthrough that never really ends up materialising. I do like that the movie goes for the more mature, slow burn vibe, letting the raw cinematography and editing do a lot of the talking. But in order to get fully immersed in that raw presentation, the screenplay needs to be a fair bit more dynamic and compelling than what we get in this film. It starts way better than it ends and lives and dies on charm alone. I thought it was decent as a whole, but I still think it could have done more. It's getting a 6 out of 10. Check it out if it sounds interesting. Okay, now on to Mikael Halfstrom's 15th narrative feature that also dropped on Netflix on the 15th of January. It's called Outside the Wire. Okay, to be fair, this wasn't as terrible as I kind of thought it was going to be going in. It's just more painfully mediocre at best. So the story. Thomas Harp is a drone pilot who, after disobeying a direct order from his higher-ups, an action that results in the death of 2 soldiers, he is paired with an android officer called Leo, and their mission is to stop a nuclear attack. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the budget for this movie was, but I'm fairly certain it was way too much. It suffers from the problems that a lot of action movies do, in that if you make one of your central characters an overpowered android with no soul whatsoever, there's a limit to how emotionally invested I'm going to get in the decisions that they make, whether they be hero or villain. Oh yeah, and the movie is also a completely thematically incohesive mess, trying to juggle the overblown action with an extremely forced anti-war message that the movie doesn't seem to have any idea what to do with. The anti-war themes seem crowbarred in an attempt to make the movie look more serious and profound than it actually is. But the movie is so on the nose in the way that it goes about exploring them that it just comes across as clumsy to me. That being said, there are a few things that kind of save this movie from being bad. A lot of them come in a lot of the character arcs and how they go. I actually really like Thomas's character. I like how the movie establishes that he's only seen death from afar as a drone pilot, and the movie shows him confront that fear head-on on the battlefield. It's no longer that distance. And I also like how the character copes with the fact that, yeah, they are responsible for the death of 2 people. Sure, he'll always be convinced that he did the right thing and it was for the greater good of the other 38 that he saved, but did he really need to make that rash decision? I like those ideas, but the movie doesn't have the good sense to delve headfirst into the psychological implications of any of it, leading to a movie that feels incredibly one-dimensional. And I don't think it's got a great ending either. I mean, it's got the right idea, but it's way too abrupt to connect properly. It doesn't give the audience any sense of the consequences that might have happened as a result of the actions that either character takes in the movie, which doesn't make a lot of sense considering the whole your actions have consequences idea. It's pretty much the reason why our character is there in the first place, is he's dealing with the consequences of his actions in the past time, which led to him killing 2 people. So for there to be no idea of any kind of consequences based on the actions that he took in the movie, in the main bulk of the narrative, kind of feels a little bit wrong. And again, thematically all over the place. Pair that with by-the-numbers choppy editing and a complete lack of subtlety, and you have a mediocre movie that's only saved from being downright bad by having slightly decently realized main characters and an okay grasp of the very raw fundamental thematic components. Nobody is going to remember that this came out by the end of the year, and I'm totally fine with that. It's getting a 5 out of 10, more just inessential and terrible, but whatever, take it or leave it. Last film I want to talk about is a Bollywood movie. Renuka Shanahi's directorial debut came out on Netflix on the 15th of January. It's called Tribhanga. Okay, so I might just have to concede at this point that I just might not be a fan of Bollywood movies as a whole. So Tribhanga is the story of 3 women from the same family that, after the oldest of the 3 is placed in a coma, are brought closer together and come to understand each one's unique struggles in life. Yeah, that's pretty much where the plot begins and ends. Now, as you can probably tell from my best of the year list that came out earlier this month, I love foreign cinema. I love how movies have the power to allow those separated by some distance from a particular culture to experience it close up and personally. However, I've always struggled engaging with Bollywood movies on a deeper level. That being said, I think a lot of it was just finding the right movie that connects with me personally, because I'll face it, I haven't really seen that many. But I find they often run ridiculously long, and the ones I've seen are so melodramatic and overblown, without having any means of really paying it off, that they just come across as frustratingly formulaic to me. And unfortunately, Tribhanga is not an exception, not by a long shot. There is maybe a certain thematic weight to this movie that I do admire in how it handles showing a family on the brink of total collapse, but it does so with the kind of plodding lack of subtlety that I'm kind of used to at this point coming from Bollywood productions. The writing is so grating and the characters so beige and indistinct, it's just hard to get invested. So the main character is super unlikable and obnoxious for most of the movie, but out of nowhere her attitude shifts, not because her character comes to a natural revelation, but instead because the plot demanded her to change at that moment. It feels so mechanical, and the movie's revelatory moment is significantly compromised as a result. None of this is helped by the fact that the movie wants to indulge in fairly heavy themes like death, how a family might cope with losing someone, divorce, harassment, but neither the writing nor performances add any kind of unique or interesting subtext to any of it, making for a movie that has an embarrassingly shallow approach to tackling its themes and wants to be celebrated as profound by the end, despite it saying approximately nothing. And this could be somewhat excusable if the story was at least coherent, but I can't even say that that's true. The movie ambles uncaringly through each woman's life experiences, diluting every point into an incomprehensible, non-linear narrative that makes me think the writers were desperately trying to salvage some kind of intelligible point out of the wreckage, but they come up empty-handed by the end. Again, there is a part of me that appreciates some of the themes the movie is trying to get to work, but it doesn't work. For all the reasons that I feared going in. Yeah, I'm still waiting for that Bollywood film that's going to win me over, but this certainly isn't it. A strong 4 out of 10. Did not enjoy this. Got 2 albums that I want to talk about now, starting off with by far the better one, Shame's Drunk Tank Pink. It came out on the 15th of January. It's the band's 2nd album. So South London punk rockers Shame are back with what might be the album to beat in 2021. On their walloping and incisive sophomore effort, Shame showcased their fascinating grasp on how to speak to the struggles of their time without coming across as either pandering or miserable. Now, make no mistake, Drunk Tank Pink is a bit of a miserable album, but not in a drudging or monotone way. And you take those ideas and you pair it with the fierce, raw, fiery punk grooves and melodies, and an impressive amount of thematic cohesion. It comes together surprisingly well, and you have a great album that will probably have cultural staying power outside of the turbulent time we're currently living in. And singer Charlie Steen is doing a lot of heavy lifting on these songs with his blazing, distorted delivery, selling these songs with the exact attitude that they need. Even when he's required to be a little bit more subtle on songs like Human for a Minute or Snow Day, or the spoken word delivery on the closing monologue Station Wagon, Steen ends up proving he's more than enough of a dynamic performer than he'll probably likely get credit. In fact, dynamic might be the word of the day when it comes to discussing this album, as it seems to ditch the stodgy, spiritless instrumental approach that I'm used to seeing from this genre in favor of way more melodic diversity. Honestly, I was just really surprised by how catchy and melodic this album is. The pounding, distorted bass on Alphabet, yeah, sure, that might set the scene very well, but it's pretty much all uphill from there, with the bright guitar groove on Nigel Hitter, the pummeling guitars and bass that careen their way through March Day, the frenetic chugging guitar and shredding hi-hats on Water in the Well, to the wailing siren-like tone on Great Dog. All of these moments would be standout tracks probably on different albums, but not here. And honestly, I didn't even really mind the synthesizers that crept into harsh degrees to really flesh it out. They ended up giving that song more of an industrial touch that's unique to any song here. I actually really liked it. Then you get to the standout songs that were probably not have sounded too out of place on Daughter's latest album, like the crushing, slow burn build-up of Born in Luton, or the howling guitars on Snow Day. Unfortunately, the album can't quite sustain that momentum all the way through, and songs like Human for a Minute and Others among the weaker tracks here that don't quite hit with the same power of the best songs. And that problem translates into a lot of the songwriting too. The thematic arc might start out pretty strong, but the album does lose a bit of steam, and the ruthlessly declarative songwriting that characterizes the first half of the album gets traded out for something a little willowier and more abstract that's not quite as impactful by the end, with the exception of the closing track Station Wagon that we'll get to in a bit. But look, there are still plenty of moments where the songwriting really works. Sure, Alphabet might be a strong opener, but Nigel Hitter is where the arc really takes hold. The song examines the everyday misery that someone living through this time might go through, how it just goes on and seems endless, only for Steen to look in the mirror by the end of it and wonder what on earth he did to deserve all of this in the first place. Maybe the best thing to do is just down some sleeping pills, turn over, and go back to bed like he tries on March Day. That idea is later echoed on Snow Day, where Steen talks about finding freedom and serenity in his own head, because you sure as hell aren't going to find it in everyday life. But Water in the Well might be even more brutal, as Steen insists that he's not interested in the preachers or saviors of this world, because he's far too burnt out to care, and he got lost on his way to heaven long ago. If there is an afterlife, he certainly doesn't fancy his chances of accessing it. Perhaps that's the only reason why the protagonist doesn't bend his own life with his own hands. Now, if this all sounds a bit self-indulgent and borderline emo, that's because it is, you're absolutely right. But Shame have the good sense to place a song like Bored in Luton very early on in the album that ends up justifying and contextualizing all of that self-indulgence. It describes how you might spend your life trying to achieve a singular goal, only to achieve that goal, reach that destination, and realize there's no one waiting on the other side to congratulate you. And, what do you even do then? From that moment forth on the album, I would argue that Steen has pretty much earned the right to be a little pissed off at the world for rejecting his dreams, and it makes his descent into introverted madness on March Day and Snow Day hit with tremendous power. And then you hit the closer, Station Wagon, that ends with a monologue that I could swear I could probably go on for hours about, but here's the short version. Steen is beginning to understand his mental health is significantly influenced by things out of his control, and he takes a big step in acknowledging that, as well as setting his sights forward. He might be carrying a lot of weight on his shoulders, but he's determined to bear it if it gives him that chance to reach the unachievable goal. That unachievable goal? Simply to be happy. A goal that's just as distant as that cloud in the sky that he describes on the song, even as it feels like it shouldn't be too much to ask, right? Perhaps the only way to reach it is to go up there in a rocket to some fictional planet of your own creation. Who really knows? When I pressed play for the first time on Drunk Tank Pink, I was not expecting an album that was going to change the way I saw an entire genre. All I was expecting, seriously, was just a solid punk album, but I ended up getting so much more. It's a shame the album seems to run out of steam in the second half, but whatever, it still rules. The first great album of 2021, I'm just hoping the rest of the year can produce albums of this quality. Solid 8 out of 10, you're going to want to hear this. And finally, Zayn's third album came out on the 15th of January. It's called Nobody Is Listening. Okay, here's a question. Is Zayn seriously still doing this again? Better question, do I have to pretend to care? It's very amusing to me that Zayn describes how he's feeling depleted on the opening song here. Yeah. You and me both, Zayn, as I can't think of a better word to describe how I felt after listening through Nobody Is Listening for the first time. Do you want to hear a performer with approximately zero charisma sing over watery melodies, ridiculously overweight bass lines about completely indistinct relationships? Yeah, Zayn, I think I've just figured out why nobody's listening. Look, there's just nothing to the production on this album outside of crushing the melodies into hazy background texture, and the result is that the album is hookless. And look, that might not be a bad approach to take, but the problem is it draws your attention closer towards your performer. And while Zayn isn't a bad singer, and on songs like Windowsill, he shows he's capable of being at least somewhat expressive, but on the majority of tracks here, he is a non-presence, sucking the already non-existent soul out of his songs. He does not have Niall's swagger nor Harry's firepower. I was honestly happier listening to Sid's contributions on the incredibly underwritten When Love's Around, or Devlin on Windowsill, than I was listening to Zayn on this album. I guess there are moments where the songwriting is occasionally amusing, not entirely sure if it's intentional or not, but it is. Like on the sex song Vibes, where Zayn describes the sex in the most unimpressed way imaginable. He describes it as far from mediocre. Yeah, not exactly high praise there, Zayn. Also, Zayn telling this girl to sweat for me over and over again on Sweat might be the least sexy thing in the history of mankind. But no song on this album is dumber than Windowsill, a song where the relationship is entirely defined by the sex, but Zayn is starting to catch real feelings for this girl, and he's too scared and insecure to admit them to her because he doesn't want the sex to feel compromised or tainted by those real feelings. I don't think it was supposed to be funny, but I find that kind of hilarious. And it might just end up as one of the better songs here, go figure. But look, occasionally Zayn and his team of songwriters stumble upon something vaguely worthwhile. Outside is a pretty simple breakup song, but Zayn describing how he wants to stay in this relationship regardless of how turbulent it might be, but ultimately leaving it in his partner's hands to decide whether she dumps him or not, is a surprising display of emotional maturity that this album could have done with a whole lot more of. As it is, this is painfully mediocre at best, unintentionally hilarious at times, and frequently frustrating, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Now, excuse me, I'm off to listen to Niall Horan's Heartbreak Weather on repeat for the 15th time, and I advise you do the same. See you next week.